Matthew, you've asked some questions in polling over this weekend, questions that nobody ever asks. Explain.
Well, one of my frustrations with how we talk about the country is we often talk about it from a very London perspective, and we tend to think that many of the things that we talk about among the chattering classes are the things that animate most people, and actually that's really not the case. So I looked at a number of policy positions over the last week that have been associated with one of the leadership candidates, Penny Mordaunt, and I just asked people, how do you really feel about these? So to give you one example, I asked them, do you think that we should refer to pregnant women as pregnant persons, which is a very fashionable thing to say among some quarters, and I found that actually only 5% of the country think we should do that. Most people actually do not want to view that issue in that particular way. And on a whole host of other issues I'm sure we'll talk about, I found much the same. This really strong disconnect on these cultural questions. And to echo you, I think, I don't call these issues culture war issues, because when you talk about women's rights and when you talk about freedom of speech, when you talk about how we teach our children in schools and universities, that's not a culture war. Those are issues that most people in the country want to talk about.
How has Westminster become so disconnected then?
I think partly it's about the way in which our institutions have become very skewed towards university graduates, and we know that if you look at politics, if you look at media, if you look at the creative industries, cultural institutions, they do lean very heavily towards people with university degrees, often from Oxbridge, Russell Group institutions, and we know that those people tend to be much more liberal, socially liberal, typically, than other voters. And we also know that over the last 5 years, a section of that group has become a little bit more radical than we might expect. So so-called radical progressives, or woke is the word that many people use. And on issues around history, the idea that we should just, look at British history as being a bad thing, a source of embarrassment.
You asked a question on the Empire, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, we asked the question, we said, do you think that the British Empire is mainly a legacy of destruction, has mainly left a legacy of destruction, which is often the argument you hear in many of the newspapers and so on. Actually, only a minority of people really think that. Only about 23% of people really share that view. And we also asked about television programmes in the past. We asked about, how do you feel about Dad's Army, which of course Penny Mordaunt in her book has said essentially these are a source of shame, that they're sort of casually racist and oppressive.
She's a conservative, is she?
Also associated those programmes with ideas like white privilege and things like that. And we said to people, well, do you think these programmes are a source of embarrassment? And only 20% said they felt that way. For many people, of course, these big television programmes, Dad's Army, Ain't Half Hot Mum, it's part of their collective memory. It's part of how they think about their British identity, and it's also something that brings us together. Of course, people tend to forget we used to only have 4 television channels. Millions of people would sit around watching these programmes. And so to simply say, well, this is the past and we want to erase it and forget about it like it doesn't matter to us anymore, actually, a lot of people don't feel that way. And you can see from the charts I've put on Twitter today, only a minority of people really view Britain through this lens.
And when we get to the Red Wall, of course, these views are stronger, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Red Wall voters, they are more culturally conservative, they're more traditionalist, typically, especially working class voters, people that, have worked from the age of 16, have gone through vocational programs, technical training and so on. And they tend to want to talk about immigration, want to talk about free speech, they want to talk about really issues that matter to them and might not matter to, Islington and, North London. So that disconnect, of course, is why Labour came unstuck with those voters. I don't need to tell your viewers that one of the big stories here is about a Labour Party that became really culturally disconnected from a large number of people. But now I bet you that they're looking at these Conservative leadership candidates.
Well,
and they're probably thinking the same.
Isn't this the point? I mean, Kemi Badenoch has dared to talk about these issues that you're talking about, but is extremely unlikely to get through to the last 2. When it comes to Sunak, when it comes to Mordaunt, and when it comes to Liz Truss, I mean, they're not going to talk about any of these things, are they?
Well, as you say, I mean, I think Kemi has talked about some of them, but she's not got that profile. She's not, some would say, hasn't got that experience. But of course, maybe we don't want experience in the sort of Westminster sense. But at the same time, I think if you look at Liz Truss, if you look at Rishi Sunak, the sort of front runners, I think there is a strand of conservative thought that views these issues as below them. That says, actually, this culture stuff, it's not very respectable, it's not sort of establishment politics. But for many people out there, they do want to talk about what's happening in schools. They do want to talk about what's happening in media, in creative industries. They want to talk about why the films we produce, the television programs we produce, the adverts they see on television, the way in which we talk about the country and we talk about our history don't actually reflect the country that they know and they love. So my message really to these leadership candidates is we need to get more voices into these institutions. We need to diversify these institutions, and we need to make clear that, you know, the sort of 20-odd% that dominate in the country, that dominate these institutions, are going to have to start to make room for other people who have other beliefs, other backgrounds. And I think that's ultimately the only way we're going to get through this era of polarization that we're seeing in America and Britain and elsewhere.